Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Old Testament in the Raw. This is Old Testament in the Raw. I hope you've enjoyed the last two episodes. If you have not seen those two episodes, then I encourage you to go back and watch those two episodes where we kind of introduce the Old Testament, talk about, the Hebrew Bible versus the Septuagint. We talked about how we should even read the Old Testament as Christians or non-Christians, whoever you are. How should we approach Old Testament literature from a modern reading standpoint? For this episode, what I want to do is just give you a brief overview of the Old Testament, okay? I just want to give a timeline of the Old Testament. This is going to be raw. This is going to be kind of in the moment. I could, Google around and find cool charts to show you. I often think that those are a little bit too busy. Sometimes I find myself looking at these charts and it takes me like a half hour just to kind of figure out what's going on. So I want to kind of give you a simple timeline of the Old Testament just so we can kind of understand where different events are placed. I just feel like it's really helpful to always kind of know where you are in the story when you're thinking about various events and characters within the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, so let's go to our chart here. And I'm just going to hand draw this, okay? So I'll explain what I'm doing here in a second. I'm just going to draw this line like this. And if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you might be able to kind of figure out, what I'm getting at here with these lines. This is going to be a little dotted line and another line there. And then I'm going to do a little squiggly line that's going to kind of tail off here. And this is not really drawn to scale too much. I'm just trying to get a big picture here. So I'm going to put a line here. And this, of course, is creation. Okay, and I'm gonna put let me put a few other lines here. Boom, boom, boom. I'm gonna put some dates here. Okay, so 2000, and these are all in BC. I'm not gonna put BC. I don't want to clutter up too much. This is all before Christ. Okay, 2000, 1500 BC, 1000 BC. Okay, and I'll explain these. I'll explain these, lines here and this little dotted line, a squiggly line. Let's go back to creation. Okay, what kind of date are we going to put here? Well, some people want to say 4004 BC. Okay, and this goes all the way back to a really brilliant Irish scholar. I believe, when was he? Like 17th century. James Bishop Ussher did this amazing project, and he went through the whole Bible and tried to date the actual beginning of creation by adding up all the genealogies, and this is the date he came up with. Now, I apologize to you Ussher followers or whatever. I'm just gonna go ahead and put I'm just going to exit out and put a massive question mark here. We'll get into the whole, age of the earth thing a little bit. I don't find those conversations particularly interesting. I'm not an expert in them. I'll tell you up front that I think there's probably better overall evidence for an old earth theory. I grew up very, young earth was kind of equated with being a Christian. You couldn't be a Christian unless you believe in the young earth. I think the scientific data and even some of the biblical data probably argues against that view, but hey, I don't want to divide the house based on how old you think the earth is. But we'll go all the way back to creation here. And then in 2000, okay, I'm going to associate the year 2000 with Abraham. I'll just say Abe so we don't have to, clutter up the screen here. Abraham lived actually before that. I believe according to one date, he was probably born in around 2166. He lived over 100 years, and so that brings us pretty close to 2000. I just want to deal in kind of rough general numbers. Then 1500, I'm going to associate that with Moses, okay? And then 1000, I'm going to associate that with David. And the Moses date, and I think Moses, according to one dating, was born in around 1526. So 1500 is actually pretty close. David, he lived right around the time, the year 1000. Then something happens in 930 BC, and that is what happens then is the kingdom divides. Okay, you have a monarchy slightly before this. You have Saul, who was chosen as to be king over Israel. And this is where Israel went from being kind of like a confederacy or a group of tribes with their own leader, like in the book of Judges. You have all these kind of tribal leaders running around. But then in 1 Samuel 8, we see Israel wanting a king. They want a king to be like the nations. And God says, you don't really want that. Trust me. And the Israelites are like, no, we want a king. We want to be like the nations. And God's like, I don't want you to be like the nations. And we want to be like the nations. All right, you sure? You sure you want a king like the nations? Yeah, we want a king like the nations. And so God says, all right, I'm going to give you a king just like the nations. And so he gives them King Saul, who rules them with a heavy hand, just like the kings of the nations. And so Saul is elected king. And then Solomon, okay, I'm not going to date these. I'm just going to put these, before. They're just one generation apart, so they're pretty close to 1,000. Saul, and then over here, oh, sorry. No. See, I screwed up here. Saul, David, and then Solomon is associated with the divided kingdom. Okay, and in 930, right in the wake of Solomon's death, right after he dies, the kingdom divides. Okay, so going back, you have Saul. That is really messy. I'm going to actually redo that. Okay, so come up here. You have Saul, David, and then Solomon. These are the first three kings over a united kingdom. It's one kingdom. Okay, in 930 BC, the kingdom divides in terms of the north and the south. Okay, so now you have a kingdom reigning in the north, and in the Bible, that northern kingdom is simply called Israel. And this can be really confusing when you're reading through books like Kings and Chronicles, where you read about this is events going on in Israel, and you just think that's like a general term for the whole nation. But actually, after 930, after the divided kingdom, after Solomon, the term Israel applies just to the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom is called Judah. And there's some evidence that, Judah, the southern kingdom, includes both the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, but it's just simply referred to as Judah, and that's where Jerusalem is. Okay, so kingdom divides in 930 BC. Then the reason why we have this kind of top line that ends is because in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is attacked, conquered, and exiled by Assyria. Now, I don't like abbreviating Assyria, so I'm just going to go ahead and write it all out. And then in we'll just say 587 is when the temple's destroyed, and the southern kingdom, Judah, is exiled to Babylon. Okay, so they're exiled away into Babylon. And then that's what this dotted line is here. This is the exile. It's measured according to 70 years you read about in the Bible. And that, if you take a literal understanding of 70 years, you can date it to the destruction of the temple to the completion of the temple. So temple destroyed in 587 and rebuilt in 516, 517. So that's, that's where you can get 70 years. Or some people say, no, it's from, the first wave of exile actually happened around 606, okay? And then the first wave of return under Cyrus the Great, when Cyrus conquered Babylon and said, you Israelites can go back to your homeland. In fact, I'm going to fund the building of your temple. He gives them money and sends them on their way. That happened in 536 BC. So the first wave of exile to the first wave of return equals 70 years, or you go destruction of the temple to the final rebuilding of the temple in 516. Either way, this dotted line represents the exile. So I'm just going to go ahead and date this to 516, completion of the temple. And then you have a few events here. It's getting a little jumbled here, but this is where you have Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, talking about what life was like in the land after they return from exile. Okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning. Creation to Abraham. That's Genesis 1 to Genesis 11, basically. Now, when we're dealing with Genesis 1 to 11, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of the chronology. Our more secure chronological dating doesn't really happen until Abraham onward. Now, there are people who try to date like the flood, Cain and Abel, and all this stuff. I just think, our means of determining these dates is really, really sketchy from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. From Genesis 12 on, when you start from Abraham, on through Isaac, Jacob, and so on, that gets a bit easier. Still a little, there's debates about that. It depends on date, how some outside sources, and sometimes those outside sources don't match up. Really, from David onward, we're getting now into more really firm dating. Okay, so Abraham, Then, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph goes down into Egypt, and then they're enslaved for several hundred years, and then God raises up Moses to deliver his people. And that happens, 80 years after Moses is born is the so-called Exodus in the book of Exodus, where they come out of Egypt, and then they wander the wilderness for 40 years, and they enter the land under Joshua. And then you have a period of a few hundred years during the time of the Judges, which kind of ends with the raising up of King Saul. Okay, so Samuel is like the last judge. If you go to 1 Samuel 1 to 1 Samuel 7, this is like the transition. Well, let's just say 1 Samuel 1 to 1 Samuel 8 is a transition out of the time of the judges into the time of the united monarchy. They raise up King Saul. So you have Saul, David, and then Solomon. After Solomon dies, kingdom divides. The kingdom in the north, Israel, kingdom in the south, Judah. Every single king in the north is evil. We'll get to that in probably many months from now. And then several kings in the south, 8 in particular, are declared to be righteous. They walked with God. They weren't perfect, but they were, not nearly as bad as the kings in the north. And then, towards the tail end of the kingdom of Judah, they are exiled and taken away to Babylon. They return. But when they return, they return geographically and physically, but they kind of don't return spiritually. And this is really important to understand as we go to kind of the tail end of the Old Testament. Israel is back in the land, but there's no king reigning over the country. They're still under the jurisdiction of Persia, so they're paying taxes to a foreign enemy, really. I mean, they were on friendly terms at first, but then it didn't go too well after that. And so they're still under the thumb of a non-Israelite nation. The son of David, this long promised, Messiah, is still a promise and isn't a reality yet. The great, glorious kingdom under the time of Solomon isn't really happening. The temple is just really, a lot smaller compared to Solomon's temple. Also, the presence of God hasn't returned to the temple. Okay. It's kind of like lights are on, but nobody's home in the temple. And so when we end the Old Testament, we leave off with this feeling of anticipation, of hope that things haven't quite landed the way we thought they were going to land, in terms of the promised Messiah and the return home from exile. So as we move into the New Testament, according to this timeline, it's like they have returned from exile, sort of, but not really. And this is why in the New Testament time period, there's lots of anticipation of what's going to happen. Of where is this Messiah? Where are the promises of God? Where is God? And how do we bring back the glory of the kingdom as it once was under David and Solomon? So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy this overview. We're going to jump in next time. I'm going to do one more introductory video on who wrote the Pentateuch. It's not a super exciting or thrilling question, but I would like to address it just briefly. And then we're going to jump into Genesis 1 and 2. So we'll see you next time on Old Testament in the Raw.